back to another episode in the Stripe Dev Chat series, again focused on SCA. So today's going to be a live coding episode that centers around making one-time payments with the new SCA Ready Payment Intent API, and we're really excited to show you kind of how we would build the Quick Start Guide. I'm CJ, Developer Support Engineer, and I'm joined by Olivier, an expert in SCA from the Stripe Payment Experience team. And as a reminder, we have a ton of knowledgeable Stripes standing by to answer your questions live in chat today. So go ahead and ask away. So here's kind of a quick breakdown of what we're going to talk about. We'll do an SCA overview, a code walkthrough, and then a quick Q&A at the end to answer any questions you may have. This is meant to be an office hours where you can ask questions that you have about SCA and also how we implemented the automatic confirmation flow for SCA. So with that, Olivier, can you tell us more about SCA and what those requirements are?
Sure, thank you, CJ. So SCA is a regulation which was implemented by the PSD2 in Europe, and it requires online payments to be authenticated with methods such as 3Secure. And so as you can see on the next slide, it only applies to customer-initiated payments. Practically speaking, that means most card payments and all credit transfers. Secondly, it only applies for payments that are made within the EEA, the European Economic Area. Tactically, that means that both the issuer of the card, so your customer, and the merchant, the business, need to be located in the EEA. When both the customer and the business are located in the EEA, this is what we call a two-leg payment. When only one of these two parties is located in the EEA, for instance, a US business charging a European card, that's called a one-leg payment. And SCA only applies to two-leg payments, not one-leg payments. The third point to keep in mind is that SCA official enforcement date is September 14. And starting September 14, issuers are required to progressively start declining non-compliant transactions that do not use methods such as 3DS. And finally, I briefly touched upon it. We expect that the main compliant mechanism in order to prepare for SCA will be 3Secure. As some of you have probably heard, like 3Secure protocol is going through a big change at the moment. And 3Secure v2, which is the new version, is expected to be slowly rolling out among banks in the coming months. But one important aspect to keep in mind, which is on the next slide, is that SCA is not required for any single two-leg transaction. Some payments are exempt and some payments are out of scope. For instance, low transaction value payments, such as payments below 30 euros, can be exempt from SCA. Another example is that any payment which is merchant-initiated, for instance, a subscription, the subscription recurring payments, do not need to apply SCA as well. And a few points to keep in mind about these exemptions and out-of-scope categories is first that it's up to the issuer to decide to accept or not an exemption. So let's say your business is running only low amount transactions below 30 euros. The bank of your customer is allowed from time to time to reject an exemption for a low amount transaction, and request SCA if they assess the risk of the transaction to be high. A second point to keep in mind on exemption out of scope is that it's up to issuers to decide if they want to support them at all or not. So they can support exemptions, but they're not required to. And for example, if you take the first exemption in the list, trusted beneficiaries, we do not expect issuers, we do not expect the vast majority of issuers to support the exemption from day one on September 14. And we do expect that support to come a bit later. So with those basic requirements in mind, I'm going to head it over back to CJ for the demo.
Awesome. Thank you for breaking that down. Really appreciate it. I see some questions coming in the chat. We have questions about, from Alex here asking if we're going to give some examples in PHP and JavaScript. And it's your lucky day today because that's the language that we're going to be working in. So today we're going to run through an example using PHP with the simple Slim web framework to demonstrate the automatic confirmation flow. And for anyone who's following along at home, the Stripe API version that we're on is the 2019-0516 Stripe API version, and the Stripe PHP SDK version is going to be 6.43. And so you can go ahead and look in your dashboard for the Stripe API version. If you go under, log into your dashboard and go to /developers. Again, this is going to be for one-time payments. We will have other pay flows. If you go ahead and check out the playlist and subscribe, you'll be notified of upcoming videos where we'll go into other languages and other payment flows. For example, using with subscriptions and Stripe billing, storing cards for later, etc. So with that, why don't we jump into some code and show you what we're talking about here. Okay, so if you pull up the Stripe documentation, you'll see that we have this page about using payment intents on the web to collect one-time payments. And there are really these two flows, automatic confirmation and manual confirmation. And we'll make a distinction related to whether or not you want to use webhooks in a new doc refresh that's going to be coming out shortly. So today we're just going to dive into the automatic confirmation flow and show you how we might build something purely from scratch. So here in the quick start for the automatic confirmation, you'll see that there's 5 steps. Create the payment intent on the server, pass the payment intent's client secret to the client, collect the details on the client, and then submit the payment to Stripe from the client, and then asynchronously fulfill the customer's order. So we're going to go ahead and build each of those steps from scratch here. So I'm starting just basically with an empty directory. All I have is a .env file that has some environment variables with my keys. So here I'm just going to kind of scaffold out what we're going to use for our directory structure. Okay. You'll see that I'm just starting out very simple. We'll have this auto confirm directory showing the auto confirmation flow for payment intents. It's going to have a client with a very simple HTML file and a simple index.php file that'll have our Slim, a code that runs the Slim framework. Right now, all of this is empty, so we need to jump into the server version and install some dependencies. So I'm installing the Stripe PHP SDK. We're going to use the Slim 3.2 version of the framework here. It's a little bit less boilerplate, a little bit easier to get started. Again, this is a sample that you'll be able to use in any PHP language. I saw someone mention in the chat Magento. So follow along, and it should be applicable there too. So the other library we're installing here is php.env. That's going to be for us to, from PHP, access our environment variables for our keys. Okay. So now that we've got our dependencies installed, I want to, let's see. I'm just going to give you kind of like a quick tour. So in the server, we have this index.php file. Again, it's blank. I'm going to add some convenience methods here in Composer for starting up the server. So I'm just going to say, PHP run the index.php file at localhost 4242 when I say Composer start. Okay. And then our client is going to be really simple. We start with some HTML. It has just some demo CSS, so it looks pretty. Put a little logo in there. Auto confirm. We'll call our shop the auto confirm shop. And then eventually, I'm just going to inline the JavaScript that we'll use so that we can kind of keep it simple and all in one place, so it's easy to read here. Okay. The next step is I'm going to set some stuff up in this PHP file. Again, this is really just to kind of like show you how we would build it from scratch. So we're working here with just some really simple primitives. So the Slim framework is going to allow us to request the contents of that client index HTML so that we have something to look at on the page. And we'll use that as our sort of base client. Okay, so I'm just trying to get us still to a point where we can actually run something. So let's see. Make sure that font is big enough. Okay. going to jump back into the server and start running the server. Okay. All right, so now we have a server running that should be serving up this page at localhost 4242. If I refresh the page, we get a decent looking, simple client HTML page here. All right, I think we're at a place where we can now go ahead and start implementing some of these steps. So the first thing I want to do is copy all of the steps here and just dump them into comments so that we can figure out where these belong. So for this example, we have these 5 steps. Creating the payment intent on the server is going to happen in PHP here on the server. Then passing the payment intent's client secret to the client, collecting the payment details, and submitting the payment. These 3 steps are going to happen on the client. So we'll put those on the client. And now we kind of have like a skeleton that we can go ahead and fill in. So step 1 for creating the payment intent on the server, the sample code here has us set our API key and then create a payment intent. Okay, and then so we'll do the first step, which is setting our API key. We're going to use .env again, as mentioned. And so we're loading the .env environment variables so that now we can call this getEnv method, which returns our keys. So we're going to load our secret key that way. And then the next step here is that it wants us to create a payment intent. Now I can't just dump this here because we're not going to be using any like server-side rendering, and we need a way to get this payment intent back from the server. So I'm going to add an endpoint, just a slim app endpoint that we can retrieve payment intents from. So payment intents, okay. So this is just going to return all of the JSON for this intent, and that should work. Okay, so I just want to test it out. So I'm going to make a request to payment intents just to make sure that we're getting back JSON, and we are. So what's happening here is that with the Stripe PHP SDK, we've got our secret key set. We are creating a new payment intent object with the amount $10.99, and then we're returning all of the JSON for that intent. Okay, so right now we are creating an endpoint at /payment intents that just returns all the JSON for the payment intent. You can see here we have a payment intent ID that ends in 1HZ. If we run the same curl request, we'll get a brand new payment intent TAH, and each of these has a property called the client secret, and this is going to be really important for when we go to process or to go through the SCA authentication flow. All right, so now that we've got that endpoint working, we have created the payment intent on the server. One thing to note is that you generally are going to create this payment intent as soon as you know the amount. So as soon as someone sort of enters checkout. That said, sometimes checkout pages will allow you to add and remove quantities of items or different items. So you might want to update your payment intent object. You could create another endpoint that allows you to update. Alternatively, you could have your payment intent endpoint receive arguments that set up the payment intent. So for example, if you had a donation page, which is a common ask, where you wanted to accept donations in variable amount where the user defined how much they want to donate, you might have your payment intent accept a post request that takes in the amount that they want to donate. And again, yeah, you can call this payment intent update method, passing in the ID of the payment intent and the associative array that has the details of the payment intent that you'd like to create. This won't confirm the payment intent or collect any money. This is kind of just like updating the settings for the payment intent, which you can do up until you have authenticated the payment intent. I believe that's correct. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Olivier. Okay, so passing the payment intent's client secret to the client. Here in the guide, we are using server-side rendering. So in the guide, we're expecting that the payment intent is being created in PHP and then rendered directly into the HTML as sort of this like data secret attribute. In today's demo, we're doing this a little differently because we have an endpoint set up. So instead of injecting this client secret here, what we're going to do is request the client or request the payment intent from the server using Ajax, and then use the payment intent that we've retrieved in the client secret that's on that payment intent. So I'm just going to do some cleanup here. We'll have an input that collects the cardholder's name. And for testing, I'm just going to put in good old Jenny Rosen so that we don't have to fill in the cardholder name every single time we're testing. And then put this card element into a field set also. Before we get too far, I want to show you what this looks like. And then I'm adding just one extra element here at the bottom called card message. And this is just going to be like a placeholder that we can use to dump in content as we're kind of debugging and watching. So it's really for demonstration purposes. So if I refresh the page here, now we have some input boxes and a submit button. For now, we know that this is always going to be just like $10.99, so we'll put that in the button. And it looks pretty okay. You'll notice that the card right now is just empty. There's no placeholder that shows the card elements or anything because we haven't mounted that card element yet with Stripe elements. So now we're at a point where we have like a decent looking form for checkout. And we have, but we still haven't retrieved the client secret. So let's go ahead and do that. So in this, skeleton of our comment here, we're going to add a call to fetch the payment intent. And for now, I'm just going to have like this global variable called payment intent that will store the raw JSON for the entire payment intent. And I'm also going to log that out. Fetched payment intent. Okay. So if we refresh the page over here, we should see a console log that says we fetched the payment intent. It has the ID of the payment intent we fetched. Cool. I think that we have completed step 2 here in passing the payment intent's client secret to the client, because now we have access on the client to the payment intent, which has the client secret. So now we have this variable called payment intent, which now has all the JSON for the payment intent that we created on the server. One of the attributes being this client secret that we'll use when going through the authentication flow. Great. Cool, cool, cool. All right, step 3, collect the payment method details on the client. So really, this is just going to be kind of mounting our Stripe elements so that we can go through and collect the card details from the user. So we're going to add Stripe.js, and then we're going to mount. We're going to create a new instance of the Stripe object here with our publishable key, and then create an instance of elements as our collection of card details. And for now, we're going to keep it really simple, and we're just going to create a card element. If you refer to the Stripe.js docs, you'll notice that there's a few different ways that you can create card elements or card number. You can create an element for a card number or the individual elements for collecting payment details. And so most of the time you can pass either the card element or a card number element when collecting payment details. So I just wanted to call that out. All right, and actually that is the end of step 3. So if we refresh the page here, you'll see that the placeholder has changed, and now we are able to enter card details. So we could enter, the 4242 card, but we haven't actually wired up any action that happens when we click the submit payment button. So that is in the next step. All right, going to step 4, submitting payment to Stripe from the client. So again, we're just going to copy what we see here in the guide and walk through each of these lines. Let's go ahead and go through these. So the first step is to grab a reference to the cardholder name. The cardholder name, again, is the input box here for the cardholder. The next step is to grab a reference to the payment button. And then finally, if the payment HTML, or if the payment button, this card button's HTML had a secret with the the payment intent's client secret injected from server-side rendering, then we would have access to the client secret string here. But because we're fetching it from the API and storing that as just a JSON object here in payment intent, we're not actually going to use this. So I comment that out and replace that one reference to client secret with our new payment intent.client secret here. So this payment intent client secret is going to reference the string for client secret. Again, that client secret being this string PI underscore and then some random value. Now, a question that we get a lot is sometimes related to this form or these elements being inside of a form. And if they're inside of a form and we're using the standard code from the guide, and when we click the button will actually submit the form before handle card payment finishes. And so one thing that I often recommend is if you have these elements inside of a form, you want to make sure that you're preventing the default action for this event. So you can say like ev.prevent default, and that'll prevent the default action of the button click event bubbling up to submit the form. So oftentimes if this is inside a form, this might be a line that you want to add. I'm going to add it here just for reference for folks that might be using this inside of a form. Okay. The next step is that inside of, or I just wanted to talk for a moment about this handle card payment function. So this actually does a lot. Okay, so we are passing in the client secret, passing in the card element, which again is one of these Stripe element mounted inputs for collecting the card details. And we can also pass some extra data for billing details, including the name and billing address of the customer. But this handle card payment method is doing a lot of heavy lifting for us. It's running some Stripe fraud checks. It's running your radar rules for 3DS. It's running these SCA regulatory checks to see if this specific payment intent requires SCA. It's checking to see if it needs to go through the authentication flow. And if it does, then handle card payment will do the heavy lifting of opening a modal for us and presenting a modal that will contain the issuer's authentication page, where then the user can go ahead and enter their credentials to authenticate the payment. Now this handle card payment, after it's done its heavy lifting of deciding whether or not to pop that authentication modal, and after that is finalized, it will resolve with a promise, and the promise resolution is resolved with this result object that either has an error or a payment intent property. And so for now, what I'm going to do is just very simply use that card message input that we created earlier. And in the success of handling the card payment, I'm just going to populate that with some information related to the response of, or the result of handling the card payment. So we hear card message. Okay. So it's going to say card message. For now, we'll comment this out. And also, before we submit that, I'm also just going to throw in a string handle. So we're calling handle card payment. All right, so let's see what that looks like. We refresh the page, we get a new payment intent that we created. If we enter the standard 4242 card and hit submit, we do not receive a modal. Oh, great. Okay, no such payment intent. All right, good. So running into some issues that you might encounter also. Okay, so if you get this message that says no such payment intent and it has a payment intent ID, this is often a mismatch between the keys that you're using and the keys that you're using on the client and the keys that you're using on the server. So the first thing that I want to do is make sure that the keys I'm using, my publishable key that I'm using in the client, matches or is on the same account as the secret key that I'm using on the server. So what I'm going to do here is open up .env and make sure that my secret key and my publishable key match what's on the client. Okay. So all right, so the publishable key was actually different. So let's go ahead and refresh the page. Enter in that same card, the 4242 card, and hit submit. And now we have a different result. Now we're getting back a payment intent, or the promise is resolving with an object that has a payment intent attribute. And if we scroll all the way down here at the bottom, we see that the status of this payment intent is succeeded. This means that payment has been collected. So we actually charged for this payment intent. Now, just for fun, what I'd like to do is enter a card that is a test SCA card. And if you go over to the Stripe testing page, there's a whole section of regulatory test cards. So I'm using this first test card here. You can feel free to experiment with different test cards for SCA by entering these card details into your form. So I'm entering the test card for SCA and clicking submit. And now you'll see something magical happens. It opens a modal that allows you to complete authentication. Now, for now, in test, this is going to be the Stripe hosted page where you can go through demo authentication. So this is really just an example. There's no way to style this. We often get a question about is it possible to change how this looks and feels? It's not. Inside of this page will actually be the issuing bank's authentication. So you might see like Wells Fargo or HSBC or something inside of here. So there's no way to change this. But for now, you see the Stripe hosted version. We'll click authenticate, and you see again, the payment has now succeeded. Okay, we'll refresh and then do the same card with a failure, just to show you what that looks like. So when authentication opens, if we click fail authentication, now the promise is resolving with an error that tells us that we weren't able to authenticate that payment. Please add another payment method. And if we go down to the status of the payment intent, so this actually has a payment intent object, we can see that the status of the payment intent is now requires payment method. So when a payment intent is in the status requires payment method, that means we have to give it a new payment method or try again with a new card. So if the status is succeeded, it means the charge went through. If the status is requires payment method, that means we have to give it a new card details or try the authentication flow again. If the status is requires action, that is a status that you'll generally encounter when trying the manual confirmation flow or doing this in a different way. When it requires action, that's when you have to go through the authentication flow. And again, this is being handled by the handle card payment method. Okay, so it feels like we're almost there, and we're actually submitting payments, but there is yet another step. So let's go back to our guide here and jump into step 5. Asynchronously fulfill the customer's order. So you might be wondering, okay, things are starting to fall into place. I'm starting to feel like I kind of have a handle on how these pieces might fit together and how I can take one-time payments. And so now you're starting to think about how can I fulfill the customer's order? And one of your inclinations might be, when this promise resolves here, if it's successful, let's make a AJAX call back to my server where I can then fulfill the order. This is actually not the approach that you want to take. And the reason is that during that authentication flow, after your customer has authenticated, it's possible that the client disconnects. It's possible that there's some sort of failure between the point where they have authenticated the payment and the payment has gone through and the point where your JavaScript code on your site is going to run to fulfill the payment. So rather than doing the fulfillment here in the successful resolution of the handle card payment action, we want to do it in one of these 4 ways. We want to fulfill the customer's orders in one of these 4 ways. So 1, we can set up a webhook. 2, we can go into the Stripe dashboard and manually sort of fulfill the customer's order. We could use a third-party application, or we can set up some sort of like background cron job that fetches recent events from the Stripe API. And so in today's demo, what I'm going to do is go ahead and set up a webhook and show you how that might work. So here, if you jump over to the setting up webhooks section, or if you just click on that link from the guide to how to set up a webhook, we give you a bunch of PHP here for how to set up a webhook. or the code basically to run webhooks. And so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go set up a webhook handler. So I'm going to add a new endpoint, maybe app post to webhooks. And I'm going to simply start with this code from the guide. Okay. And go through these one by one. So we have an endpoint secret. This is going to start with whsec. You can find your endpoint secret by logging into your dashboard and going to webhooks. And when you open up the webhook, you'll see this signing secret. You can click to reveal, and that will show you the webhook secret. Oh, that's fun. Okay, so this shows you the webhook secret. Alternatively, there is a really awesome new tool called Stripe CLI that you can use when testing webhooks to have the webhooks sent to your local environment. So the way that this works is you call Stripe listen -- forward to, and then the endpoint that you want to forward these webhooks to. And that's going to print out a webhook secret that is, it's limited in time and scope and is available just for like 90 days and really is just for testing. But this is a really awesome command line tool that you can install. You can install it with Homebrew. If you want to go ahead and check out the Stripe CLI, there was, the previous SCA dev chat talked about this a little bit, but this is another one of the really powerful tools that Stripe CLI provides, is this forwarding. So here, what we're going to do for our webhook secret is I'm going to just take the key from Stripe CLI and dump that in here, and then walk through this line by line with you. So the payload is going to be this raw body. You want the payload to be the rawest form of the request body as possible when you're constructing the event with the signature header and the endpoint secret. This is because sometimes you might have middleware that modifies the format of the JSON that's coming in. You might see some different, different decorations on the body that are coming in, but those are going to throw off the signature. And so we want to make sure that we have the most raw version of the request body here. This is pulling the Stripe header, the Stripe signature header off, and those three arguments are used to pass into construct event that will verify that the signature is correct and make sure that this post request came from Stripe and wasn't just some random person on the internet sending post requests to your webhooks endpoint. Okay. These are for a little bit different framework. So I'm going to return just some JSON with a failure message if we enter into either of these blocks. And I'm going to use the 400 status code for this one and 403 for this one. The reason I want to use different status codes is that in the webhook output here, we'll see the status code of the response, and then we'll be able to tell which of these two blocks it went into if we failed for some reason the webhook. Okay, this next section here is where we would define all of our sort of like case statements for the different types of events that we want to handle. In this example, we are going to show how to handle the payment intent succeeded webhook event and the payment intent failed webhook event. So again, just kind of cleaning these up. And then at the end here, I'm going to just return some JSON again with message success. And this JSON, okay, so just to like break this down even further, we often get questions about webhooks and how these work and do you have to call them? So this webhook endpoint is going to be something that receives a post request directly from Stripe when an asynchronous event happens. So in our example here, as soon as someone authenticates the payment, Stripe will send a post request to your webhook URL, which you can set up here in Stripe, in the Stripe dashboard directly. For the example, Stripe CLI is going to be the proxy where Stripe is sending a webhook event, Stripe CLI is catching that and handing it off to your webhook endpoint. The nice thing about using Stripe CLI instead of another tool like ngrok is that you don't have to worry about your tunnels being left open or a number of other security things. You don't have to publish this all the way out to the public web. You can kind of just listen for events and then have them handed off to your local web server. Okay, so the whole point of this was to fulfill orders, right? And so what I want to do in terms of like demonstration is just show that when we get a payment intent, we'll log out that we created a new payment intent. So payment intent or new order. Okay, and we'll just put the ID of that intent. And then when a payment intent is successful or fails, we'll log that out also. So here we'll just say that it was a paid order and a failed order. Okay. So in your own system, there's a couple things to note here. In your own system, when you're processing webhooks, the recommendation is that you receive the event, you store off the data for that event, and then you schedule some background task to go handle and process that event, and you then immediately respond with some 200 response back to Stripe. If there are too many errors that are sent back when handling your webhooks, your webhook endpoint can be disabled. Also, oftentimes when a payment intent succeeds or when an order is being fulfilled, you'll have a bunch of heavy lifting you need to do. Maybe you're sending emails, maybe you're printing PDF invoices or communicating with some sort of inventory management API. Those are pretty long-running processes that you'll want to push until after the request and response cycle has completed. So the general recommendation is that you receive this event, you store off the data for the event, and you schedule a background task to go process that event later. Obviously, that's a little bit more advanced, and we're not going to do that today. But we just wanted to call that out as sort of a best practice in terms of handling webhooks. Okay, so if we go back to our page here and refresh, and then look at our server logs. So when I refresh the page, remember that a new payment intent is being created, and we can see here that in the Stripe CLI's log, we are seeing that we are receiving payment intent.created events. So that's just kind of like an example of one type of event that we might receive. So if we put in the card that we know always works, that trusty 4242, and click submit, we'll see that the payment intent, we started with a payment intent created. Then we also got the charge succeeded and payment intent succeeded. And here in our server logs, we see that we started with this new order QLT, and then it became paid. So that's awesome. Furthermore, if we test one of these SCA cards, refresh the page, okay, and then hit submit, you'll notice that we got the payment intent created event, but we did not get any like payment intent authentication started. There are no events that are related to telling you that authentication happened or is starting to happen or succeeded or didn't. We just have like this abstraction of whether or not the payment intent succeeded or whether or not the payment intent requires authentication. So if we complete the authentication here and finish, we'll see that we get a payment intent succeeded event that comes through, and our order should be marked as processed. Okay, so we did get a paid order again for this JDV. All right, so one thing that I wanted to show you was that what happens if it fails authentication, okay? So if someone enters this SCA card, which should be good, and then they enter the wrong PIN, okay, it's gonna come back and say invalid request error, payment authentication failed, we need a new payment method to try again. And then again, in our webhook handler, we're marking this order as failed. So this is now showing up as a failed order. So before refreshing the page, we can enter new payment details and go through the same authentication flow, noting that we didn't refresh the page. So we're still working with this payment intent H4Q. H4Q is still what we're seeing here. in the JavaScript console. And now if they put in the correct PIN and authenticate, we now have a successful payment intent that went through. Okay, so let's just go make sure that we have no more steps. And it looks like the next section here is the manual confirmation quick start. So we have successfully finished the 5 steps for collecting payment with payment intents and webhooks. And yeah, hopefully this demo was helpful. I think at this point we're ready to answer some questions. I see there's been a lot of stuff flying by in chat, and I'm curious. Yeah, if Olivier, have you seen any questions in chat that were particularly interesting that we can answer live?
There were quite a few. I think most of them were answered already in chat.
Okay, cool. Great. Yeah, I'm just going to going up the chat here and looking. I know one question that we got was regarding the most recent updates to, in some of the countries, in the EU, they've put out information around delaying the start of SCA. I'm curious if you can speak to that.
Sure, happy to. So the official enforcement date of SCA is September 14, so in a few weeks. The European regulator, the European Banking Authority, released an announcement a few weeks ago that allows national regulators in each country to implement a phased enforcement of SCA beyond September 14. So far, some regulators, such as the UK, France, and Germany, have announced some high-level positions in favor of such a phased enforcement, but we are still waiting for specifics around these delays. And for that reason, we still recommend our users to continue preparing their integration for September 14, because we built our APIs in order to only request authentication when it is required by the banks. Meaning that if there is a delay in a country, or with a bank, the API will not trigger authentication until it's actually required. And so there is no downside essentially to migrate.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So yeah, it seems like while some countries might delay, there is definite urgency to make sure that we're on time for those countries that are going to be ready September 14th. So it does make sense to kind of just get it implemented now. And again, because it will work in countries that don't require SCA, it makes sense because you can just set up this customer experience where people will go through the payment flow and it will be sort of transparent to them, and they will never even know that this is an SC-ready payment integration if no authentication pops. So it really makes sense to move over as soon as possible. I'm curious. I noticed that one of the questions in the chat was around ideal. Could you speak to maybe the different payment methods that folks might need to use when being SCA ready, and kind of what the state of different alternative payment methods are other than credit cards, or is this only for credit cards?
No, it's a good question. It's for all payment methods that are customer initiated. So credit cards, when you think of it, were a bit of an exception, where the only form of authentication was the card number and the CVC. Like most other payment methods, like Ideal in the Netherlands or Zofort in Germany, are already 2FA'd. And so for that reason, we do not expect any change in the user experience after September 14. Okay,
awesome. Yeah, I'm just kind of looking through some more of these comments here. Let's see. Oh, the other thing that I forgot to mention was that while we showed a way to implement payment intents directly, if you have your own checkout page or your own flow for collecting payment, one-time payment, Stripe also has a brand new SCA-ready hosted checkout solution. So if you were in a place where you wanted to kind of allow Stripe to do the heavy lifting in terms of collecting payment, one option would be to use checkout, which is a very simple way that you kind of just create a button on your page that has a little bit of information behind it that when clicked brings you to a Stripe hosted beautiful solution that you can go ahead and collect payment from, and that also supports other payment methods like Apple Pay that people are really excited about. And so I wanted to call that out as another option, and then point out again that we have these payment intent documents that are really, really good, and those guides. As you saw, kind of as we were going through, we were able to copy and paste most of the solution there from the guide. So we'd really recommend checking those out. Now, one other thing to call out is that this, again, was an example of how to do one-time payments just in that one flow where we're collecting the payment up front. We're not saving card details and then collecting payment later. And we're also not setting up a subscription for billing. So if that interests you, go ahead and click subscribe, and there will be future episodes where we'll dive into those and show you some really similar examples where we can go through and do some live coding with these other payment flows. Cool. Awesome. All right. You have any other questions here? I think we might be coming up on the end here of questions. Again, we really want to thank you for joining us for this week's Dev Chat. We hope you found it useful. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to check out some more Dev Chats and other videos, hit that big subscribe button. Check out the links in the description for links to some GitHub repos where we'll put up the code for this. And we also have a new and growing list of Stripe samples that are complete samples that you can look at for solving different new payment intent and SCA pay flows. So go ahead and check those out. Yeah, and I think we'll see you next week. Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Olivier.
Thank you, CJ. Bye.
All right, cheers.